Hello, hello! Welcome back to Loki's Library, and if you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina, and this is where I am reading through the enormous library of books that you see behind me, and then I give you a quick synopsis and tell you what I think about them. So if you like books, just aren't sure what to read next, hit that subscribe button, like and share my videos, and let me know what you think in the comments. I'm a day late this month for the president, just reasons, reading, yard work, a whole bunch of going on, but I'm here now with this week's book / president, Eisenhower, Soldier and President, the Renowned One-Volume Life by Stephen E. Ambrose. The accompanying cocktail is allegedly one of Eisenhower's favorites. It's a transfusion, which is 2 ounces of vodka, ½ ounce of ginger syrup, ½ ounce of lime juice, 2 ounces of club soda. This gets poured over Concord grape ice cubes, although in my case I made one giant grape juice ice cube, and garnished with, candied ginger and Concord grapes. So let's do this. Stephen Ambrose is arguably one of the best-known World War II historians. His book, Band of Brothers, about Easy Company and the 101st Airborne and their movements through Europe in World War II, was, of course, made into a 10-part HBO series. I think it was 10 parts. His son Hugh wrote The Pacific, which was also adapted by HBO. Ambrose also wrote a 2-volume biography on Eisenhower, which he condensed in 1990 into this 1-volume biography. And yes, I picked this biography because I read Band of Brothers in the past and knew that Ambrose was highly readable. I think I made a good pick on this one. So, Dwight David Eisenhower, was nicknamed Ike by his family, was born October 14th, 1890 in Denison, Texas. He was the middle son of 5 boys born to David and Ida Eisenhower. In 1891, the family moved to Abilene, Kansas, which is where the family set down roots and would raise their 5 sons, basically. Eisenhower is another example of the Great American Dream, basically. I mean, the family was not wealthy by any metric. They had a whopping $10 collectively when they landed at Abilene, Texas, which in today's currency is about $344. And from that, they raised 5 boys, one of whom would lead the country to victory in the Greatest War and then become President of these United States. So that is a success by pretty much any metric. Eisenhower was a good student overall. I mean, he wasn't necessarily the smartest boy, but he was a good student. He, I got, B's and C's, but he did famously have a bad temper. And after one such towering rage, and this is kind of an early anecdote from his own memories, one advantage of doing books about presidents who lived in the last 100 years is there is lots and lots of written evidence about them. Not like Washington, who burned all of his personal documents. Well, this is going to take forever. But after he had basically a screaming fit, he was 6 or 7, but his mother sat him down and said, quote, "He that conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh a city," and lectured him then on the futility and self-destruction of rage, and that he needed to conquer it. This was, she said, basically all my kids are prone to these fits, but you are especially prone, and you can't let it rule your life because it will ruin your life, which is solid advice for basically everybody. Don't let rage run your life. It will ruin it. And he took that to heart, and he set about conquering his temper, which he did quite ably. I mean, he more or less controlled it from that day forward. I mean, people who saw him mad, it was usually a put-on. He very rarely caved to that absolute towering rage that he could have. So now history almost took a dramatically different course when Eisenhower was a freshman in high school. He was, playing with his brothers, other kids, whatever, and he fell and scraped his leg, which at the time seemed like nothing, and he was more irritated that he had damaged his pants than that over the injury itself, until the injury got deeply infected. To the point where the doctors were talking about amputation as the only way of saving his life. And obviously, if he had lost his leg, he would not have gone on to lead the life he did, which led to the presidency and us having him on hand for World War II. Close enough. Fortunately, Eisenhower heard the doctors talking about the plan to amputate and told his brother Edgar, "Don't let them do it. I would rather be dead than have them be missing a leg." And luckily for us all, he did survive. And when he was, I have to shake this up. Because club soda is carbonated. You don't want to shake carbonation. We have seen that happen. Let's shake this up real quick. Oh, this is supposed to be a 9-ounce glass, but that is so not going to fly. That should have only been 5 ounces, but that is not going to take 2 ounces of club soda. Well, shit. I gotta go grab a different cup. Alright. Yeah. My enormous ice cube will work. 2 ounces of club soda. There. Instead of doing a fancy toothpick, I'm just chucking shit in now. So, when he was 19, he took a competitive examination for admission to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. Now, he intended to go there because his good and lifelong friend Everett Swede Hazlitt was enrolled, and Eisenhower took this competitive exam intending to, I'm going to make a note here that I got to correct that, intending to join Hazlitt at the Naval Academy. However, Eisenhower only scored second among 8 on this exam, and that was apparently not good enough for the U.S. Navy. Second place was just no-go. I guess they were only taking 1. I don't know. Again, lucky for all of us, because second was more than enough to score Eisenhower a place at West Point. And at 19, he headed off for college, where he was kind of a middle-of-the-pack guy. I mean, he's kind of cruised through. We'll see how it goes as the ice cube melts. He was a little bit of a rebel. I mean, not enough to get kicked out. He stayed the course. He did pick up smoking, a habit which would eventually grow into a 4-pack a day habit. I'm mentioning this now because when he quits, you'll be impressed. 4 packs a day, Camels, if you're interested. Now, while at West Point, he learned one of his more valuable skills, that of being a coach. It wasn't a role that he initially wanted, but was basically the only one that he could stay connected to sports with. After a football injury blew out his knee. It basically just exploded on him, and it required surgery and forced him off the field. Now, he quickly learned that he was adept as a coach. I mean, quite good at it, actually. He graduated in 1915, and before taking up his first duty station, he had a summer off, which he spent in Abilene visiting with family and friends, and his first love, Gladys Harding. However, Harding's father did not approve of this match. He didn't want an army life for his daughter, and because he said no and basically put his foot down, she broke it off with Eisenhower before he headed off to his official duty station at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. Obviously, they were not meant to be together because, like 2 months later, October of 1915, he met Mary Geneva Dowd, better known as Mamie. And they were married within the year. And although they were certainly friendly, I mean, it may not have been a love match, but they had enough regard for each other that Gladys kept his letters, and they were friendly enough that when her husband died in 1944, so 1944, from the front lines of the war, Eisenhower sent a letter of condolence, which she kept. And when he became president, Gladys tied all of his letters together with a note for her son that said they shouldn't be published or even opened until after her, Ike, and Mamie had died. Because she respected him, she respected Mamie, she respected them as a couple. And I think that says something about her as a person, and him for the sort of people that he surrounded himself with in his life. Now, he met Mamie in October 1915. He proposed Valentine's Day of 1916, so 4 months later, and they married July 1st, 1916. And they were together for 52 years. There was some rumors during the war that he may have had an affair with one of his secretaries. I don't believe it, personally. Just from what I read in this book, I'm inclined to think that she had a thing for him, and he rejected her advances. This is my sense from reading it. Obviously, I wasn't there. I don't know. Nobody's ever going to actually know the truth of his relationship with his wartime secretary and assistant, other than him and the secretary, but I don't believe it personally. Now, Eisenhower's biggest disappointment was that he did not see combat in World War I. However, his experience during World War I did something else that contributed to his success during the next war. He was put in charge of troop training, interestingly enough, first at San Antonio, where he trained the 57th Infantry. Then he was moved to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, where he was put in charge of training officer candidates. On September 24th, 1917, his first son, Dowd Dwight, a.k.a. Icky, I don't know why Icky, but that's what they called him, he was born in San Antonio, Texas. In February 1918, Eisenhower was ordered to Camp Meade, Maryland, to join the 65th Engineers, which was the group in charge of the 301st Tank Battalion. And this was exciting. He fully expected to be sent over with the tankers to the trenches in Europe, until his orders changed again, and he was instead sent to Camp Colt, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he was put in charge of training the Tank Corps. He did a really good job in there. On October 14, 1918, he was temporarily promoted to lieutenant colonel. This would have been called a brevet promotion, or it would have been if they still had the brevet ranking. And this was ahead of a planned deployment to Europe. They fully intended to send him with the tanks, until, unfortunately for Eisenhower, peace broke out in Europe in November of 1918. And while he never saw combat, his training efforts were well recognized and appreciated. In 1919, he was recommended for the Distinguished Service Medal. So he was 39, 90 to 10, 10 to 100, yeah, 39, 20, 29, 39, 90 to 00, 00 to 10, 10, 29. Holy shit, he was 29 years old. And he was recommended for the Distinguished Service Medal. And that was awarded to him in 1922. And Eisenhower then spent the next 23 years of his life as a staff officer for the U.S. Army. And no shame in that, truly, that he worked his way through every training exercise he could and passed the Army's Command and General Staff School with flying colors. He learned at the right hand of some of the absolute best. He spent 10 years under the tutelage of General Douglas MacArthur, and I believe it was like 4 years under George Marshall. And due to his work with them, they both enthusiastically endorsed Eisenhower for command role over the armed forces in Europe when the United States entered the war in 1941. While bouncing around from base to base and command to command, he made good friends with basically all of his contemporaries who had joined him at the front in 1944. And during this time, he had both tragedy and happiness. Tragedy when his son Icky died of scarlet fever on January 2nd, 1921. He was like 4. And then happiness when their second son John was born August 3rd, 1922. And John would follow in his father's footsteps, becoming a West Point graduate and joining his father on the European front during World War II. Eisenhower was initially sent to Africa to take over there, and after basically making a clean sweep out of Africa, including some time in Italy's boot, I think he helped take over Sicily, he was rotated over to England to take over and plan what would become D-Day and the Battle of Normandy. Now, obviously, this is all a very rapid summary. There's a lot more that goes into all of this. One of his strengths and one of the reasons that he was recommended for this was that he never just made a decision without hearing all the sides' opinions. And that seems like it might take forever to make a decision, but it probably contributed to his effectiveness as a leader because everyone could contribute a different point of view, and he knew that. And you never knew which point of view could change the course of history, literally. So, and ultimately, Eisenhower knew that any failures would come to rest on his shoulders, so he wanted to make sure he had all the information before making a decision. And that saw him in good stead throughout the war, and obviously brought us to victory, since those of us who speak German do so entirely by choice. Now, when the war ended, he held the title of General of the Army, which was making him one of like 5 men to hold that rank. And he was also given the rank of a 5-star general, which again is virtually unheard of. He held that rank until he became candidate for president and had to retire in order to run. And he had to retire that commission because he couldn't hold a political office while being a general. That would make it more of a military coup, and we don't do those things in America. We certainly enable other countries to hold their own military coup, but that is not the story of this story. Yeah, we're not bad. Now, that rank, incidentally, was reinstated him by act of Congress when he stepped down from presidency, because he, regardless of whether or not they loved him or hated him, he was a well-respected man in his day. Now, following the war, he had to figure out what to do with his life, and he had several options available to him. He most decidedly did not want to be president. That was not on his list of jobs that he was ever going to seek. Truman did offer to support him in that position, but Eisenhower was not really interested. He did write a book about his war years, for which he opted to take one large payment rather than royalties, which unfortunately probably cost him several $1,000,000, because the book remained a bestseller for like decades post-publication. I want to say like through the 80s it was one of the bestsellers of World War II. It might even still be a bestseller of World War II. I mean, man on the ground, the man who led us to victory, wrote a biography, or not a biography, wrote his memoirs, basically. It would be like Grant, those memoirs were and are bestsellers. The sale of this did allow him to buy a house on the edge of Gettysburg battlefield. I think this was the sale of which allowed him to buy this house. which he loved. That became his and Mamie's home. They owned that until they each passed away. But prior to being president, so after the war ended, but before he was nominated president, he held 4 jobs. He was the head of the American Occupation Zone in Germany. He was the chief of staff, military chief of staff, like of the army. Yeah, he took over Marshall's position. President of Columbia University and Supreme Commander of NATO. The only one of these 4 positions that he didn't actually excel at was president of Columbia University. I mean, he did not understand the academics, not meaning the course material, but the teachers, because academics are their very own breed of stupid. Okay, I shouldn't say that. They can be very smart, they just have absolutely no common sense or ability to live outside of academia. And they didn't really understand him because of that. And he didn't understand them because they lived their whole pampered lives sheltered in place on university campuses. We have this problem today. His other jobs, though, I mean, his usual take-charge demeanor led the way, and his ability to get along with most people, his willingness to listen to everything. I mean, he did his usual outstanding job as a commander, and that was his milieu, and he was really on top of the world when he was in place as a commander. And again, throughout all of this, he kept insisting he had no interest on being president, and I don't think that consciously he wanted to be president. I mean, based on everything Ambrose presents in the book, he wasn't really angling for it, verbally. But if you ascribe to the very real adage that actions speak louder than words, Eisenhower's actions tell a very different story. I mean, he made numerous public appearances, always without remuneration, spoke candidly, and managed to make friends with the rich and powerful. His speeches were all calculated to garner public demand for his candidacy. Truman quite famously stopped speaking to him when he came out as a Republican, and Eisenhower still did not put him forward as a candidate. He kind of went with the old school belief that if he was pressed into service via accolade, he would gladly serve, but he would never, but he would not run on his own initiative. Only if he was, demanded to serve by the people. And then, of course, the Republicans nominated him in 1952. He resigned his commission with the Army, and he won quite handily, becoming our 34th president, and overseeing the one decade of the 20th century that did not have war, did have increasing prosperity. I mean, they had 2 very minor recessions, but no inflation. I mean, he stopped inflation cold, and I'm still kind of curious as to how he did that. Now, all of that sounds great, right? He wasn't perfect. Sounds like he's perfect. He really wasn't. Part of his successes was his absolute moderation. He was a middle-of-the-road president who didn't want to accept the majority. Wait, what? That makes no earthly sense. I have to adjust that too. I don't know what I was writing there. He was an absolute moderate. All right, he was a middle-of-the-road president. And how did that work out for him? Well, I mean, he wanted to unify the Republican Party. He wanted to bring that extreme right wing of the Republicans closer to the center. Didn't manage to do that. He disliked McCarthyism. I mean, he genuinely thought McCarthy was a quack. However, his way of dealing with McCarthy was to ignore him. Eisenhower seemed to believe that if he gave no attention to McCarthy, he would just fade from the mainstream. Unfortunately, this gave McCarthy more publicity as the media followed the House Un-American Activities Commission quite closely, and McCarthy's antics fueled the Red Scare in America. If Eisenhower had ever once stepped up and said, "We don't need to do this, this is America, everybody has the right to free speech, even the speech you don't agree with," things might have changed. Ultimately, Eisenhower was able to see McCarthy flame out by taking an action no one really expected. He ordered members of the executive branch not to respond when subpoenaed. I mean, he made sure that was legal. I mean, there was no precedent for it one way or the other, and so they're like, sure, you can tell them not to go. Basically, anybody who did go just pled the fifth, and that was it. And McCarthy flamed out in a bunch of mad denials and apparently alcoholism, so one for the team, buddy. But in the years that McCarthy ran rampant, civil liberties suffered, tremendously in America. It was interesting that who did fight back was Hollywood, believe it or not. They got one right, and then they took it too far because Hollywood does everything in excess, and now they went the other way. One thing Eisenhower did quite well, although he didn't seem to think so in later years, was the appointment of Earl Warren as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Most people don't know who that is, but my eyes got big when I saw that. I went, oh God, the Warren Court. You may not know who Earl Warren is, but everyone is aware of the effects of the Warren courts in America, since Warren oversaw Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, which reversed Plessy v. Ferguson rule of separate but equal education and demanded integration of the school systems. He also oversaw Gideon v. Wainwright, which required public defenders for indigent suspects. You know, that right to an attorney. It used to be you had the right, but you had to pay for it yourself. The Warren courts were like, no, that's a guaranteed right. You have the right to counsel, so we need to supply that counsel if the person can't afford it. He also gave us Miranda versus Arizona, which gives us the famous Miranda warnings. The ones all officers are required to provide a person when placed under arrest, the ones that begin with, you have the right to remain silent. We have that because of the Warren courts, and Warren was appointed by Eisenhower. So that was something he did that ended up being outstanding, although he actually did not necessarily agree with integration. He thought that it shouldn't be forced by the government, that it should happen organically. It's highly debatable as to whether or not it ever would have happened organically if the matter wasn't forced. I mean, we'll never know, obviously, but there's a good debate on that one, which seems unlikely. Now, Eisenhower, like a good chunk of people back then, was casually racist. He did believe that he was president of all Americans, regardless of color, but his sympathies tended toward his Southern friends, not wanting black kids to be sitting next to their white kids in school. So he was more or less happy to just let Brown versus Board of Education fester until he was forced to take action. And that, of course, happened when the governor of Arkansas decided to stir up a mob against integration in Little Rock, which basically forced Eisenhower to mobilize the troops and ensure the safety of the black students. Integration happened. It was messy. It was a tense time. Ultimately, it died out into a big nothing burger. I shouldn't say that. It's not a nothing burger. It was a very big deal, but he dragged his feet until he was forced over a barrel into doing it. Now, he did end the war in Korea, obviously. I mean, almost as soon as he was sworn in, he ended the war in Korea. And he kept America out of Vietnam for a decade before we actually joined that fight. I mean, they were trying to push us in as early as like 53, 54. And he was like, no, we need to stay out of Indochina. It's an absolute mess over there. We don't want our troops there. He tried very hard to make peace with Khrushchev, but the mistrust between America and Russia was just too great. There was no trust there. During his presidency, he had two health scares that damn near knocked him out of the office. Both occurred after he quit smoking, in case people are wondering if that 4 packs a day contributed. When he was like 59, his doctors advised him to cut back to a single pack a day. He decided that counting cigarettes was pissing him off more than not smoking, so he went from 4 packs a day to cold turkey, which tells you all you need to know about the man's willpower. I mean, no wonder he was put in charge of the war in Europe. That's 4 packs a day to nothing. So he was 59 when that happened. So that'd be 1949. He had his first major heart attack in late September 1955. Now, as far as timing goes, this could not have been better. The country was between crises at the time. Because it was between crises, Nixon was able to oversee things while Eisenhower recuperated and was given the green light to run again in 56 by his doctors. The second health scare was a mild stroke, which occurred November 25th, 1957. He recovered from both of those and experienced relatively good health until like the last year of his life. During his tenure in the White House, the intelligence community basically ran amok. And I don't want to go too far into the weeds with the bashing, because one of the IC's aphorisms is that our failures are televised, our successes never see the light of day. And there is quite a bit of truth to that. We won't actually know what they got right in the decade of the 1950s until the CIA decides to declassify all of those documents, which they're going to do on their own timeline. Some of their failures, though, include Hungary in 1956, which was trying to break free from the Soviet bloc, and the CIA failed to back them. I mean, they really wanted to, I think, but Eisenhower wouldn't give them the green light because he knew that would heat up the Cold War, and he really didn't want to be in charge of a shooting war again. One of the other major failures, which is well known and well televised, was the loss of a U-2 spy plane over Russia, which he tried to pass off as a training flight gone wrong over Turkey, until Khrushchev said, no, that's not going to fly because, you see, we have the plane and the pilot, Francis Gary Power, who was eventually traded during a spy exchange, basically. Cuba was an absolute clusterfuck, which started under Eisenhower, although when things kicked off at Bay of Pigs, Kennedy would call Eisenhower in for a consultation, which, again, tells you a lot about Eisenhower and how deeply he was respected. He did manage to balance the budget, and he kept it balanced, which is surprising. Part of how he did that was by controlling defense spending and slashing the DoD budget, Department of Defense budget, The Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, were not happy with this, but he did seriously try to control the arms race and roll it back. Unfortunately, in the few short years between the end of World War II and Eisenhower's ascension as president, the military-industrial complex, a thing which had not existed prior to World War II, had obtained a firm grasp on both the legislature and the terror stirred up by McCarthy and the Red Scare. And it's been a major power player ever since its inception. Names like Lockheed, Boeing, these companies have been influencing policy and law ever since. This was a well enough known fact that in his farewell speech, he said, and this is direct quotes from his speech, all right? This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power and will persists. The military-industrial complex should never be allowed to, quote, endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted, end quote. So this was a known thing. In a decade, they had raised themselves to the role of absolute power players. Now, when Kennedy stepped up, Ambrose described in detail that Eisenhower disliked the Democrats in general. He absolutely abhorred their campaign promises of higher defense budgets and the promise of more deficit spending, but he seemed to like Kennedy personally. So when Kennedy called for advice on the Bay of Pigs, Eisenhower responded, a perspective he was able to offer on two fronts. One is that when he stepped down from the presidency, Congress passed an act returning him to his pre-presidency status of five-star general. So he was able to offer legit military advice, not just from, his decades of service as an Army officer, but he was, in fact, a ranked five-star general when he was asked that advice. And then he was the former president, whose oversight of the CIA led to the Bay of Pigs, so he was able to offer presidential advice as well. And when Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson also leaned heavily on Eisenhower for advice, which he gave up until he suffered his second heart attack in November of 1965. Now, at this point, he began to kind of wind up his fares. He didn't know when he was going to die, but obviously he knew everybody dies, and that his mortality seemed to be fast approaching. He'd had his second heart attack now. He was definitely slowing down in age, but he was comfortable with that. All right, he was comfortable with his mortality. He had his third major heart attack in April of 1968, and after a month at the hospital in March Air Force Base, he was transferred to Walter Reed, where he would basically remain under doctor's care for the rest of his life. So, it was 9 months, basically, in a hospital. From his hospital bed, he endorsed Nixon for president, suffered several more heart attacks, the last of which was on March 24th, 1969, and he passed away 4 days later on March 28th with his wife and son in attendance. And he had a chance to say goodbye to all of his grandkids. In fact, one of his grandkids married Nixon's daughter. I think it was his grandson who married Nixon's daughter. It might have been his granddaughter who married Nixon's son, but I'm almost positive it was his grandson who married Nixon's daughter. This was an excellent book overall. It looked at Eisenhower as a whole person. It provided clear accolades on the things he did well, like his brilliant campaign in Europe. The world, I think, would be a very different place if Eisenhower hadn't been where he was at that point in time. If they had amputated his leg when he was 14, he never would have been at West Point. We wouldn't have had an Eisenhower available to assist us during that time. But Ambrose was also brutally honest about Eisenhower's failings, like his incredibly weak track record on civil rights in the black community. His failure to lead on that issue is a pretty glaring indictment of his leadership abilities, if you believe it. which I do, because he believed he was, the president for all Americans, but he failed to protect the Americans who needed him the most. In his summation of Eisenhower's years in the White House, Ambrose points out that judging Eisenhower through the lens of time tells you more about the people doing the assessment and the judging than it does about Eisenhower. The only way to judge Eisenhower is to view him through the time in which he lived, which is true of any of our presidents, right? I mean, time changes things. Political and world events change things. What was normal 80 years ago, I mean, hell, what was normal 30 years ago is no longer normal or accepted. I think part of Eisenhower's success is that he was a moderate. He went out of his way to include that middle ground, something that no political candidate today is even attempting. We in the middle are basically just told to fuck off and vote for one of the two majors, because otherwise the other guy is going to win. The Libertarian Convention was this last weekend. I didn't go, but I am not happy with who they selected for the presidential candidate. I might actually abstain from voting for a president this year because I am not impressed with who the Libertarians selected. One of his biggest contributions was his attempt to roll back the military-industrial complex, and he tried very hard to convince America that there was no danger. And part of why he failed in that mission, at least from the perspective of, 70 years later, is that he didn't want to reveal just how solid our intelligence assets were. So he knew that we didn't need to be ramping up our armaments because our intelligence assets were phenomenal. The U-2 flights were incredibly successful. Our embedded agents and personal assets were telling a very different story from what the media and the military-industrial complex were selling and what McCarthy was reporting. And the real story is that by any metric you care to use, the United States had the Soviets outgunned by like 5 or 10 to 1. I mean, it's absurd how well stocked we were as a military, and I mean the military. I'm not even talking about the average American's penchant for collecting and hoarding firearms. I mean, our missile ramp up during the 1950s was absolutely off the charts, and if we had needed to or wanted to, we could have literally bombed Russia back into the Stone Age without using nuclear power. That's how well armed we were back in the 50s, and Eisenhower knew that. But he couldn't say that out loud without waving a giant red flag in front of, the Reds. Pun intended, sort of. So he tried to rein in the military-industrial complex, but could not do so without destroying the intelligence assets that we might need should the Cold War heat up again. Now, he did oversee a decade of peace and prosperity for America, which is something that had not been done since Coolidge was in power, and I don't think has been done since either. I don't know. It's certainly not the 60s, right? Because we had Vietnam in the 60s. That rolled into the 70s. Panama was in the 80s. But was that... You know what? We're going to find out. A lot of war in the 20th century, except for in the 1950s. I think he was the best possible president we could have had for that decade. And the pressure that was put on him to heat up the Cold War, to drop nukes when just because it was an option. I mean, never mind that the damage that it would have done to the planet. It was an option, and there were people who believed that he should use that option on, like, Korea. And it was tremendous. But because he had the military experience to recognize and know what a true threat was and what wasn't a true threat, he knew that we were able to steer clear of war, and he did so. And that's it for this week. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you guys next Sunday. Yes, it will be Sunday, not Monday. Bye.